This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our 2025-2026 season opened on September the 17th with Military History Night and featured Tyler Wentzell. Tyler told us the story of Major George Geordie Beal of the 48th Highlanders and his World War II service in Italy and the Netherlands. Take it away, James and Tyler.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's Military History Night. I'm the event chair, James Ellis. I hope everyone had a great summer, and it's so nice to see a great turnout for what promises to be, as always, a fantastic full season of speakers at Military History Nights. Tonight's speaker joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 2002 through the regular officer training program. After graduating from the Royal Military College in 2006 with a degree in history, he was commissioned into the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, where he served as a platoon commander and battalion training officer. In 2008, he deployed to Afghanistan as an operational mentoring and liaison team leader for a reconnaissance company of the Afghan National Army. In 2008, he transferred to the 48th Highlanders of Canada and currently serves as the regiment's commanding officer. He has a law degree from the University of Toronto and a master's in war studies from the Royal Military College. Since 2018, he has taught on the Joint Command and Staff Program at the Canadian Forces College in various capacities. In his civilian life, he is a student of military law and history and is completing his doctoral degree at the University of Toronto. Please give a warm welcome to Lieutenant Colonel Tyler Wentzell.
Good evening, everyone. I do want to just say that I have completed my PhD now, so I'm happy to say that I don't have that much yet. So it's an honor to be with you tonight to tell you the story of Major George Geordie Beal, and I am extremely honored to be joined tonight by his son, also Major George Geordie Beal, right over here. Please give this gentleman a round of applause. So this talk has, at no extra cost, a built-in fact checker. So if I make any errors, they are mine and mine alone, and Geordie can call me on it. But I did want to say, Geordie, thank you. You've been so helpful and supportive in this research project, and I'm grateful for it, and I'm grateful for you being here tonight. So the expression "a follow me officer" is it's sort of an old-fashioned term, right? We don't usually use that term nowadays, but I kind of like it. It's a term that when you hear it, you automatically know what type of leader you're describing. The role of the infantry is to close with and to destroy the enemy. The motto of the infantry corps is "Ducamus, we lead." And a good leader in the infantry must, of course, lead from the front. He can't simply send soldiers forward to do what they cannot do themselves. Kim Beattie, the author of the 48th Highlanders Regimental History, described Major George Beal as a follow-me officer, and he certainly was. He was an exemplary officer, and yet just low enough in rank not to attract much notice. See, in Canada, we rarely write histories about our general officers, let alone the company commanders, the battalion commanders, the regimental sergeants major, the company sergeants major, who get the job done, who execute on these plans. So tonight, I'm happy to share with you the story of one company commander who executed on these plans and routinely snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Always have to start with an agenda. What will I cover today? First, I will tell you about Major Geordie Beal's life before the war. By the way, I will randomly refer to him as Geordie or Major Beal. I never met the man, but I've studied him enough and read his letters that I feel like I didn't know him. Second, I will cover some of his more notable experiences in the Second World War. We cannot cover the entirety of his war experience because he commanded an infantry company and sustained combat operations for more than a year. This is an extraordinary record of service, perhaps unmatched in the Canadian Army because people usually moved around. He commanded the same rifle company throughout almost that entire period of time. And the man wrote a letter home to his wife practically every day, more than 1,000 letters. And I've reviewed many of them, but not all of them, and they provide just so much insight into the type of man that he was. So I'm going to share with you just three of my favorite stories about his time in the war. First, his role in the Battle of Ortona in December 1943. Second, his critical role in the assault boat crossing on the Lamone River in December 1944. His company was the only one to meet its initial objectives, securing the bridgehead that ultimately allowed the entire brigade to cross that river. Third, Major Beal's company command during the liberation of the Netherlands. The 48th Highlanders had the wonderful experience last year on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the liberation to have 43 soldiers of the active regiment to visit these sites and walk the ground in the Netherlands. It was a tremendous honor. Geordie William Beal was born in Uxbridge, Ontario in 1908, and he came to Toronto where he attended the Upper Canada College. He went to the University of Toronto from 1925 until 1928. He studied 3 years in finance, and then he started his career. In 1928, he began as a bookkeeper at the brokerage firm of F. O'Hearn and Company Limited, which later became T.A. Richardson and Company Limited. He was a floor attorney, was very good at his job, and was employed in this capacity when the Second World War broke out. So in short, he was a happy, married man with a good, well-paying job, an education behind him. There was nothing that was forcing him to join in the Second World War. He was a volunteer in the truest sense. Before the war, Geordie was best known for his prowess as an athlete. The photo on the left, this was back in the day when professional athlete wasn't really a thing. These were people who lived in their communities and were just the best athletes that you wanted to watch play sports. He was the quarterback for the Toronto Argonauts. He did that for 5 seasons, had an impeccable record, and he only retired when they introduced the forward pass to Canadian football in 1929. The sport changed, he moved on. He also played hockey at a very high level, and he would return pretty frequently to play in various competition matches even after the war. So even though he was a little bit older than most of the volunteers at the outbreak of the Second World War, he had the energy of a younger man. He was an athlete, and he carried himself that way. You can debate when the Second World War well and truly started, but for Canada, it began in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, Britain's declaration of war, and just days later, Canada's declaration of war. Canada mobilized a division to send overseas, and then there was a long pause. This pause was known as the phony war. No one really knew what was going to happen until a phony war came to a conclusion on May 10th, 1940, when Germany invaded France. The evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk began on May 26th, and the next day, this was the front page of the Globe and Mail. British troops fighting magnificently repulse every assault made by Germans, bellowing falls to Nazis after fierce battle. They put a brave face on it, but if you actually read the article, everyone knew this was bad news. This was the British Expeditionary Force engaged in combat with the German army in France, and they were being pushed out of France and being encircled. This was a tremendous disaster. This was a shock to the system. This is what the newspaper said the day Geordie Beal walked into the University Avenue Armories to volunteer for service overseas. This was a man who understood his place in world history. He was not conscripted. He was not forced to go. He literally read the newspaper that day and knew what he had to do. He went into the University Avenue Armories, volunteered for the 48th Highlanders of Canada, but why the 48th? Now, obviously, commanding officer, I'm a little biased. It's a great unit. It's always been a great unit. But there was actually a personal connection, because when he played on the Argonauts, one of the other players was Bill Darling. And a lot of the 48th Highlanders in the room, of course, know the Darling family, and they know another gentleman named Bill Darling. But Darling and Beal played together on the Argonauts, William Beal was already in England with the 48th Highlanders of Canada. This was the natural choice for Geordie. He specifically volunteered for the 48th Highlanders. He trained through the summer and shipped out in the fall. What kind of officer was he? Well, here's a couple of quotes that were in his file or elsewhere. His battle drill training assessment in November 1942, so this is when they ratchet up the stress level for junior leaders, says aggressiveness, leadership ability, ability to grasp and apply battle drill, good officer, led his commands well, but was inclined to go off the handle at times. Now, if your instructor writes down inclined to go off the handle at times, that means it happened more than once. It means it happened more than twice. This was a man who had a bit of a temper. The photograph on the right is Major Beal in Italy. Note the kilt, note the hose, and the quote below that was written on the back of that photograph when he was the commander of Able Company. Complete with kilt, hose, and typical quizzical grin, wee Geordie is a little bundle of dynamite and capable of tremendous explosions. But if you are still standing after the blast, everything goes fine. A good egg. Aggressiveness is not a bad quality in an infantry officer, as we shall see shortly. But he was famous for his temper. He was a bit older than most, as I mentioned, but he was fair, and if he came to agree with you, you were doing just fine. His nickname, according to the regimental history, was Spitter Beal. We're light on details about how he got that nickname, but I would offer to you that Spitter isn't a nickname you give to a wallflower. This was a man who had more than a little bit of aggression, and this would come in handy. Also, he's described as wee Geordie here. He was 5'5", which was a pretty standard height by the day, and a stocky gentleman by standards of the day. So that's your Spitter Beal. The Italian campaign. During the summer of 1943, the 40th Highlanders were part of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily that would be followed up by the invasion of the Italian mainland. But Geordie was not among the soldiers who went ashore in Sicily and the southern part of the Italian boot. You see, there's good reason for this. One of the lessons learned from the First World War was that an entire battalion could be massacred in a single day. Think of, for instance, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment at the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel, where the colony of Newfoundland lost practically an entire generation of men in a single day. That could not be allowed to happen in the Second World War, so there were policies put in place to make sure that didn't happen. They described the system as the left out of battle system, the LOB or LOB system. Before any planned battle, the brigade commander would hold back a portion of all the troops. And it was a pretty high proportion. So in an infantry platoon of 33 soldiers or so, they would hold back 6 or 7 troops prior to the battle. So imagine as a platoon commander, you're supposed to have 33 troops, 6 or 7 are held back by the brigade commander and will be released when the brigade commander sees fit. And then within your fighting organization, you also need to maintain a depth section and an uncommitted reserve. This actually makes everyone's job a little bit harder, but it meant the battalions could survive to fight another day. Following the same logic, the units that went ashore in Sicily did not do so at full strength. The 48th Highlanders had 5 officers at different levels of command who were pulled out of the unit, and they were not sent into Italy until November 1943. Then they arrived as reinforcements. Geordie Beal arrived in November 1943. He went to the support company, and his first primary task was to move the regiment's echelon from your area at Campo Basso northeast to the Adriatic Sea. That was where the 1st Canadian Infantry Division would fight on the Lower River, the Gully, and the infamous town of Ortona. This is a fairly famous image from the Battle of Ortona, and it is of soldiers from the 48th Highlanders. Like many of the iconic images of the First and Second World Wars, it is entirely staged. So for those of you with a military background, I know I always looked at this photo and thought, why are they so close together? That's because it's a staged photo. But it's a staged photo in the rubble of Ortona, and it was one of the images that was sent home to communicate to people what was going on out on the front. Ortona is a reasonably well-known battle, but just as a quick summary, Ortona is remembered as Little Stalingrad. It's a town on the Adriatic coast, and it was Canada's first real exposure in the Second World War to fighting in built-up areas. All the challenges of dealing with machine gun-swept streets, booby traps, and mouse holes cutting through the interior of the building walls. The fighting in the town was mostly conducted by the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, consisting of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, and the Seaforth Highlanders. Less remembered was the fighting that happened outside of the town. This was a division-level fight. One brigade went into the town, and another brigade went around in an attempt to encircle the Germans, to complicate their situation. That part of the operation is remembered as Cemetery Hill, still part of the Ortona battle line. So this map is from the regimental history. The short version, you see Ortona on the right-hand side. It is on the coast. You see down in the middle at the bottom, Hastings and Prince Edward position. That's their starting line. Their job, the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade's job, was to drive north and east to threaten that road that runs north out of Ortona. And by doing that, they would be closing a trap around the Germans, which would make it seem a lot less enticing to remain in their defensive positions in the town of Ortona. Okay. You see that where that Hastings start line is? Well, that's pretty far away. And yet, the German defensive position went all the way out there. It was the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment's job to clear the mines, breach the obstacles, and make an opening such that the tanks could pour through, and the other 2 battalions, the 48th Highlanders of Canada and the Royal Canadian Regiment, could drive north and east to threaten that road. However, the plan didn't work. As is often the case, the enemy gets a vote. The Germans fought such a vigorous defense of the start line that although the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment were successful in clearing the minefields and creating the breach, it took them the entire day. So the whole day came and went, and the planned progress that was supposed to happen in daylight could no longer proceed. The situation had changed, they had to adapt. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Johnston, the commanding officer of the 48th Highlanders of Canada, decided to do something a little bold, maybe a little crazy. The regimental history refers to it as the daring gamble. That's the title of the map here. Because instead of fighting by day and securing successive positions to get to where we need to go, instead we will infiltrate the German rear area, grab a hill, set up an all-around defense, and present the Germans with a problem that they must deal with. That hill became known as Cemetery Hill. And that night, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Johnston led the battalion, single file, through the dark, destroying small positions that they identified in the dark, mostly with unarmed combat, because any shots would give away their position, until they made it to Cemetery Hill. This was a very bold plan, but it had to be done because otherwise the brigade fighting in the town of Ortona was in a world of hurt. So this had to happen. Now, the problem for the 48th, of course, is that if you infiltrate the enemy's rear area and you take up a defensive position, you are by definition now surrounded. And that was the problem that they would have to deal with when the sun came up the next day. What was Geordie Beal's role in this fight? Well, Geordie was in the support company. His job wasn't to go with the battalion. His job was to deal with the seemingly insurmountable problem of supplying a battalion that has now put itself in a position of being entirely encircled by the Germans. So, This is fighting for support, which we talk about a lot these days. This is exactly the problem that Geordie Beal faced. His job was to get there in time for Christmas Eve with the most essential of presents: ammunition, rations, water, and SRD, service rum diluted. It was unfathomable that the troops would not have their rum ration on Christmas Eve, and he would do his damnedest to ensure that that rum arrived on time. Geordie also brought Lieutenant Colonel Johnston's Christmas wish back to the brigadier. Lieutenant Colonel Johnston asked Santa Claus for a Sherman tank for Christmas, and in fact, he would get more than one. Geordie wrote in a letter home, I'll use his own words to describe what happened. They hadn't had any food for 48 hours and their ammunition was nearly gone, so we had to do something. Well, that night I took 80 men of the Saskatchewan Light Infantry as a carrying party, plus the stretchers to carry out the wounded, and started off. Luckily, it was a pitch black night, but dear, I was really worried whether or not I could get through. We got through, though, right through the enemy lines without losing a man or a bit of the essential stuff we are taking in. We got out the wounded also. When I arrived at the battalion at 5 minutes to midnight on Christmas Day, believe me, dearest, I was a Santa Claus. It was lucky I did get through because the following morning the battalion was counterattacked and they did a marvelous job and drove the enemy off. The tanks arrived just after the counterattack and they finished the job. The following night I took in through the same route with the enemy. Still there, 135 men with rations plus ammunition plus heavy machine guns. And now today the situation is cleared up, and due to the good work of the 48th, there is a big breakthrough and the Germans have drawn well back, leaving behind heavy casualties. We are all proud of the way the regiment did their part, and they are the talk of the whole 8th Army. The battalion held on until December 27th, when the Germans withdrew from Ortona. At significant cost, the 1st Canadian Division had achieved a hard-fought victory. Geordie had shown his mettle in keeping the battalion supplied under these terribly difficult conditions. Soon after, Beal was made the commander of Able Company, a rifle company which he would command for the rest of the war. Now, like I said, cannot give all the airtime I would like, so I'm going to be jumping ahead an entire year. So from December 1943 to December 1944, a battle that I think it's safe to say very few Canadians have heard of, the crossing of the Lamone River. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division took heavy casualties before and during and after Ortona. The division took in another large batch of reinforcements in the new year. In May, the division would reach the Hitler line, and in August-September, they would fight through the Gothic line. Geordie Beal commanded Able Company through all these actions, but as I said, we're going to jump ahead to what is generally known as the Battle of the Rivers, specifically the crossing of the Lamone River in the north in December 1944. River crossings are inherently challenging operations. Rivers are natural and formidable obstacles. Defending them doesn't take much effort. Crossing them takes a tremendous amount of coordination and planning. The defender has the advantage. The 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade first attempted to cross the river in early December. They tried crossing with 2 battalions, the Royal Canadian Regiment and the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment. It did not go well. They took heavy casualties and they were ultimately repulsed. It was a terrible setback with tremendous casualties. The 48th Highlanders were ordinarily part of that brigade, but they were not thrown into that initial crossing. I'm not really sure why, but this meant that they were fresh and ready to go when the division decided that they were going to try and cross the river again. So this time, instead of attempting to cross the river with a understrength brigade, they were going to cross it with a overstrength brigade. So they added the 48th Highlanders of Canada to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade. So now the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade had 3 battalions plus the 48th Highlanders. That much stronger, that much better chance of being successful. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade would secure multiple crossing sites to get the troops, trucks, and tanks across so that they couldn't just cross the river, but they could then exploit the crossing and push as many tanks as possible to expand the bridgehead quickly. The operation began on the evening of December 10th. For the 48th Highlanders, the plan called for Captain Geordie Beal's Able Company to cross the river the hardest way there is, besides swimming, I guess. They would cross in Mark III assault boats. Mark III assault boats are made out of wood and canvas, and the only way they get anywhere is through the muscle of paddling them across the river. Once across the river, their position would protect the construction of a bridge. So Able Company would row across the river, secure a bridgehead, and the engineers would build a bridge. Okay. Baker Company would then cross that bridge, and most of the brigade would pass through this one bridge. That bridge was absolutely critical to the brigade's plan. Of course, as we've seen already, plans rarely survive first contact, and this night was no different. When Able Company put their first Mark III assault boat into the river, in the dark, in December, in northern Italy, cold, dark, wet, it was a heavy current, and the first boat flipped, dumping out all of its crew. A less level-headed commander, he had a temper, but he was level-headed, would have either stuck to the plan and ordered his troops to just do exactly what the original plan had called for, or started shouting up a storm and modifying the plan too much and drawing attention to the position, and then the Germans would know they were there. Geordie Beal had the sense to react quickly and quietly. He got enough rope to create a rope ferry across the river, which gave enough stability to the boats so that all the other boats were able to get across the river quickly, quietly, before the Germans knew that they were there. They did this in pitch black and in total silence. The first two platoons got across quickly before the German defenders knew they were there, and once on the far bank, he immediately started creating a defensible bridgehead position. Now remember, the engineers are supposed to be building a bridge right next to them. Baker Company is supposed to be providing support. The engineers start building the bridge. They set up the first abutment. They lay in the first span. They lay in the second span. They lay in the third span. Everything's going well. The river's flooded. It's deeper and wider than they had assessed. They have precisely one span too few. And an incomplete bridge is entirely useless. So now Able Company is the only company on the other side of the river, and none of the other bridges are going to work. The commanding officer of the 48th Highlanders, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Mackenzie, orders Baker Company to move down the bank and to get into Able Company's boats. Baker Company starts making its way across the river into Geordie Beal's bridgehead. Geordie takes Able Company, takes Baker Company, expands the bridgehead, makes it defensible. For all intents and purposes, he is adapting and also performing the function of the battalion commander on the other side of the river. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie realizes this is the only way that this is going to work. He pushes the 3rd Rifle Company of the 48th Highlanders, Charlie Company, into the same boats. But now the brigade commander gets wise and realizes that he's got one opportunity to get the rest of his units across. The brigade commander sends a company from the West Nova Scotia Regiment. They cross in Geordie's boats. And then 2 companies from the Royal 22nd Regiment, the Van Deus, they cross through that bridgehead. The rest of Charlie Company gets across, and now the battalion headquarters with Donald Mackenzie gets there. Through the night, the German defenders focus everything they have on attacking this bridgehead and attacking the boats as they're crossing. And one by one, they damage and destroy these boats. By the time the sun comes up, there is one boat left. Almost the entire brigade has gotten across the river through Geordie Beal's bridgehead. When Dog Company, the last unit to go across, finally goes, there's one boat. They have to do it many, many times to get the company across the river. But at this point, the brigade is on the other side of the river thanks to this one bridgehead. The engineers are able to complete the bridge, and then they can get the tanks and the trucks to the other side of the river and exploit the crossing. It was a hard-fought battle. Geordie was mentioned in dispatches for leading Able Company, and Donald Mackenzie, the commanding officer, receives the Distinguished Service Order for this operation. Now, crossing the Lamone River was the beginning of a month-long fight in and around that bridgehead. Geordie wrote in a letter home that he did not change his uniform once in the month that followed. It was just continuous fighting until he was ordered to go to the rear and bathe. But the Italian campaign was almost done. After the Lamone River and Fosso Vecchio, there was a series of defensive operations, there was a lot of patrolling, but really the main theater of the war had transitioned to Northwest Europe. D-Day happened in June 1944. The Allies had won the battle for France. Operation Market Garden had failed to get the Allies across the Rhine, and the Canadians still had to clear the Scheldt estuary. The Battle of the Bulge showed that the Germans could still launch offensive operations. It was time for the Canadians in Italy to go to Northwest Europe and join the other Canadians who were there. Operation Goldflake is not the most exciting operation to learn about, but it was a highly technical and difficult operation. They moved 60,000 soldiers out of Italy into Northwest Europe, and the Germans didn't notice. This was an extraordinary feat of deception, an extraordinary feat of logistics. The 2 Canadian divisions and 1 British division were already in Northwestern Europe by the time the Germans had realized they left Italy. It's absolutely spectacular. But again, not a particularly, you'd never make a movie about an operation like this. But by April 1945, both of Canada's corps are poised side by side to liberate the Netherlands. This was the first and only action in the Second World War in which the entire Canadian Army fought together. And it was an extremely important time. It's one of the reasons why the Canadian contribution to the liberation is remembered so much, because it came at the tail end of what's known as the Hunger Winter. Somewhere between 18,000 and 20,000 Dutch civilians died of starvation during this winter. And it was the Canadians and our allies that drove north to liberate them. There's a lot going on this map, but the main takeaway is if you look on the right-hand side of this map, there is a blue line. That's the IJssel River. The IJssel River. The IJssel River goes north to south. The 1st Canadian Corps is on the left-hand side of the IJssel River. That's all the red lines you're seeing. And the 2nd Canadian Corps is on the east side of the IJssel River. The IJssel River is the center of their advance. The 1st Canadian Division's job is they are going to follow the 2nd Canadian Corps on the east side of the river. So the 2nd Canadian Corps is going to drive from south to north. The 1st Canadian Division is going to follow them, and then they're going to cross the river and head west towards the city of Apeldoorn, driving into the German rear area. So here you see the close-up. There's the IJssel River on the right-hand side. The 2nd Canadian Corps is pushing from south to north on the right-hand side. And you see these lines. The Seaforth Highlanders are going to cross in the south. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry are going to pass a little bit north of that. They're going to establish a bridgehead. And then the 48th Highlanders are going to pass through Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry north and then head west towards Apeldoorn. Okay, so that's all the movement stuff. The campaign in Northwestern Europe had a lot more resources than in Italy, a lot more mechanized resources specifically. You'll remember that Able Company crossed the Lamone in canvas boats that they paddled themselves. Well, they would cross the IJssel River in buffaloes, amphibious, tracked, lightly armored vehicles. The troops loved these things. You could get to the other side of a river without your boots ever getting wet. Completely different way to fight. So the PPCLI got across the river very quickly, very efficiently, secured the bridgehead, and repulsed the various German counterattacks that happened through the night. The 48th Highlanders began crossing into the bridgehead on April 12th. The troops got across very quickly. Again, mechanized vehicles, they just went across the river, got to the other side, boots nice and dry, they were ready to go. However, they needed to raft the Sherman tanks across the river. That took time. So even though most of the infantry was on the other side of the river by 6, 7 a.m., it wasn't until 10:45 that the tanks were across the river and that they could meet up and carry on with the advance. They were obviously very eager to get moving because with every passing moment, they were losing the element of surprise. And at the risk of overly generalizing Dutch terrain, let me just say simply that it's flat, it's really flat. There's basically two types of terrain features, dike and polder. So there's the flat piece of ground and then the high piece of ground. Being in the flat piece of ground isn't great. Being on the high piece of ground isn't great either. This was the nature of the terrain they were fighting in, either a high feature where you were silhouetted or a low flat piece of ground where there was no cover at all. Also, most of the letters and contemporary accounts make note that although the Dutch have extremely orderly farms that manage the water extremely well, it is a country that's mostly below sea level, the hunger winter left many of these farms poorly tended for obvious reasons. And that meant there was a great deal of flood. So this was very difficult terrain to fight. Able Company's job was to advance north from Wilp on the left-hand side. Able Company almost immediately hit a snag. They initially made good time, but then they hit an organized defensive position. There were 6 machine guns and 3 self-propelled guns that the Germans had positioned in a hasty defensive position. They took a great deal of fire. Beal radioed back, "It's a little sticky and a little blizzard." Communication was sporadic, and Lieutenant Colonel Donald Mackenzie was more than a little bit agitated because he didn't have a good sense of what was going on at the front, and they were not making time the way he wanted to. He went forward on a personal reconnaissance at approximately 3 p.m. and was killed by shelling. Beal was not the type to sit back and wait for instructions. He was already formulating a plan to destroy the position that was obstructing his advance. He crawled forward to the platoon, to his lead platoon. This required him to crawl on his belly 200 yards on that flat terrain I was describing, 2 football fields. When he got there and had better eyes on the German defensive position, he called for artillery on the gun position. That artillery certainly wounded and killed some of the German defenders, but more importantly, the combination of shrapnel and smoke delayed their firing and gave him the lull that he needed to launch his attack. He launched a flanking attack, outflanked the German gun position, and destroyed it entirely. Meanwhile, Major James Council had taken command of the battalion and moved forward to survey the situation. I was talking with my table over here during the dinner that I think this is one of the indicators of a highly professional, proficient unit. Usually when commanders go down, things come to a grinding halt. This was an example of a unit where the commanding officer was killed and most of the soldiers didn't know he had been killed until later that day. The deputy commanding officer rushed to the front, immediately took over. As he was taking over, Geordie Beal conducted the attack I just described. The whole machine was clawing its way forward, and by the time James Council was at the front, had figured out what was going on, Geordie Beal had destroyed the position in front of him, and Charlie Company, which was immediately behind him, leapfrogged forward, and they continued the advance. It wasn't until the end of the day, when they were safely in Twello, arriving in the downtown, that most of the troops found out that their commanding officer was the first one of them to be killed that day. There was a brief lull in Twello because there was a large number of German positions that needed to be mopped up from there. So there was a day pause where the 48th was in Twello, and the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment pushed forward. 2 days later, on April 14th, the 48th Highlanders were again in the lead. Their job was to push up to the Apeldoorn Canal. This was again fighting in urban terrain, not as dense as Ortona. However, a lot of buildings, a lot of constrictions, a lot of inability to maneuver. It was imperative that Geordie Beal and his Able Company reach the canal on time. They needed to get there by 1830 that day to maintain the pressure on the retreating Germans. As the company moved out, they once again came under intense machine gun fire, this time from a German position on a high piece of ground overlooking their route. The entire company was pinned down in ditches and the clock was ticking. Realizing that any delay could upset the broader operations timeline, Geordie Beal made a split-second decision. He didn't have time to go around the position. The ground didn't lend itself to a flanking. It would be an old-fashioned bayonet charge. Beal gave the order, fixed bayonets, gave a minute of rapid fire to put the enemy's heads down, and then he led his 2 lead platoons in a bayonet charge against the German position. The move was so bold, perhaps a little crazy, but surprised the Germans to such an extent that those 2 platoons were able to cover that 150 yards of open ground with minimal casualties and destroyed the German position obstructing their advance. They reached their objectives at the canal on time. They took 7 Germans were killed on that position and 18 German prisoners of war were taken on that position. They linked up with other platoons. 29 additional German soldiers were so shocked and awed by what had just happened and the loss of the covering machine gun force that they surrendered. Major Beal's decisive charge neutralized the threat and opened the floodgates for victory in that sector. On April 17, 1945, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division liberated Apeldoorn, and by early May, the war in Europe was over. Geordie Beal received an immediate military cross for his actions in the Netherlands, both events that I just described. I've given a very abridged version of Major Geordie Beal's work. I jumped over nearly a year as a company commander, and at the end of the war, he also led a flying column up to the North Sea. He ran a camp to handle SS prisoners at The Hague. But I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the man and his family, because sometimes when we tell these stories about the daring acts of soldiers, it's easy to lose sight about the family at home. Geordie Beal was a volunteer. He was never drafted, never conscripted, never forced to do anything. He was married and he had a well-paying job. He gave all that up. When he departed for England, his wife had just given birth to their first child. Their son, here in the room with us today, was 6 weeks old when he left. The family knew the risks. They aren't just both named Geordie Beal, they're both named George William Beal, because they knew that there was a strong chance that Dad wouldn't come home from the war, so at least they knew the name would live on. Reading Geordie Beal's letters home is heart-wrenching. I am a soldier, but I am also a father. And when you read it, you can tell that this was a man whose head was in the fight in front of him, but his heart was at home with his loved ones. For instance, remember the story I told you about what he did in Ortona? In between those 2 patrols that he led, this is the letter he wrote home. Dearest, don't get the idea that I'm low in spirits, because I am not. We are beating the Germans, and I feel sure that 1944 will see us finish and we will get our break. My love for you is stronger, if possible, than ever, and someday we will get our reward for our sacrifices, I am sure. My heart is with you and with wee Geordie, especially on this Christmas day. He, capitalized, referring to God, takes away and gives Ruth and I am sure that he will and is thinking of us and others who have been separated for so long. God bless you, my Ruth, and keep you and our wee son. Keep your sweet chin up, darling, and remember that I'm very proud of my wife and son. The image of you makes me keep on in this rotten war. I will write you tomorrow if possible, darling. I love you. After he wrote that letter, he stepped off on his next patrol. Right before crossing the Lamone River, again, he knows that he is going in canvas boats as the lead company for the battalion crossing the river. He says, "We are going into our last battle in Italy, and we will be in it by the time you get this letter. But don't worry, dear, because your love has always brought me safely through, and I know it will this time too. It is a rotten time of the year to have to fight, but the war must be finished off quickly, and the only way it can be is by fighting and killing the enemy. I know you will worry, sweetie, but try not to worry too much, because right now I can say that there are very, very few officers as battle-wise as your big Geordie." This is a long quote, but in many of his letters, Geordie made it clear that he knew that there was an evil in this world that had to be confronted. and the only way to confront it was to make sacrifices. He would do so that his son would not have to fight those same fights. This letter was written to his wife in 1942. I'll give you a moment to read that. I'll emphasize a few words. It is hard to put into words, sweetest, how one feels, but someday we will all have to leave this earth for a better world. And when that day comes and we meet all that have gone before us, and my ancestors ask me if I had carried on the fight for right, as they always did, I want them to be able to say, yes, I did, and take my rightful place with them. And because, my love, if we don't win this war and cut out this cancer, my son and you, my darling, will have no peace or happiness on earth. Reading this man's letter, I was constantly struck. I think a lot of us perhaps drift through life without a sense of where we are in the fabric of history. This was a man who absolutely understood the world that he lived in, with a wisdom that really surpasses anything that I claim to have. And that photo, remember, Geordie Beal was 6 weeks old when his father left. Here's the young boy watching the parade as the 48th Highlanders of Canada returns from the Second World War at the University Avenue Armories, just down the road from us. And besides the words of his father's letters, has no memory, because his dad left when he was 6 weeks old. In this case, it's a story of a family reunited, but it is a sobering thought when we think of all the people that did not come home, who made the same sacrifice. Thank you for listening to Major Beal's story. May his example of courage, leadership, and humanity continue to inspire all of us. Thank you. So it's a legitimate offer. That's my email, by the way. If you're curious about anything or just want to chat about military history, I'm always game. But happy to take any questions you might have. And we have a tremendous resource in the room as well. So. Oh.
Colonel, I'm wondering about the landscape in Holland. You talked about the landscape they fought in later. I'm wondering if you could compare that to what the First Division faced in the Shell previous autumn.
So the 1st Canadian Division didn't fight in the Shell.
Sorry, 3rd Division Shell.
Yeah. Plenty of similarities, but one of the major distinctions, of course, is in the Shell. It was necessarily a joint campaign. So because of the nature of the Scheldt estuary, there were elements of the Canadian Navy, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, small boating squadrons, all kinds of things like that had to be integrated in the planning. Nothing nearly as complicated as that in terms of a joint fight. In fact, the Scheldt is a really interesting campaign to study because it's one of the rare examples of a truly joint fight in Canadian military history. So if you think of, say, Walcheren Island and the causeway that the 3rd Division had to fight through, it's almost as much of a Navy battle as it is a land battle for people who are interested in studying joint warfare. The Liberation Campaign that followed, that launched in April-May 1945, they didn't have to deal with those kinds of water features. So in some ways, it was less complex, but I'll go back to this map. The phasing was impressively complex. So Operation Cannon Shot was the 1st Canadian Infantry Division's crossing of the LCol River and proceeding west towards Apeldoorn. So that's the arrows you see in the top right, going from the right to the left. Okay. Now the arrows that you see going from the south, those are, that's Operation Anger. Remember, Market Garden, the attempts to secure the crossings on the Rhine River, it was actually Canadians that did secure the bridge at Arnhem, Operation Anger. But that whole operation was phased for two reasons. Number one, to set the conditions so that the Germans were put off guard and were displaced, but also to eliminate the pockets that the Scheldt facilitated. So the evacuation of the Breskens pocket, for instance, they had to ensure that we did not give the Germans those kinds of opportunities, and that led to kind of this next level of maneuver. So it's kind of hard to go through with all this, but it was flatter ground with less opportunities to move soldiers and evacuate them by water. But they still couldn't move fast. So it was the 5th Canadian Armored Division in the south that was driving south to north for Operation Anger. They were moving as fast as they possibly could. But the number of bridges and rivers and flooded ground that's there made it very difficult for mechanized terrain. So on the one hand, they didn't have to deal with the joint fight, but on the other hand, it was still the land component fighting all of these water obstacles, very few of which were necessarily on the map. And if they were only dealing with the ones on the map, that would have been hard enough. Does that kind of answer your question in a roundabout way?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll go over the map with you in person a little bit more after this.
Why did you choose his story in particular to study and to tell?
So this has been more than when did I start? I've been working on this for about a year and a half, 2 years, I think, Geordie. It started with a research project on Donald Mackenzie, who was the commanding officer who was killed in this battle. At the 48th Highlanders, there's an event that we do. We've done it for a long time. It's called the Mackenzie Shoot, and it's done in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Donald Mackenzie. And I wasn't necessarily satisfied when people gave me his life story. I was very curious about that, so that's where I started. Bugging Geordie, getting into the archives, getting some files, learning about it, and the more I learned about his life, the more interesting James Council became, and Geordie Beal became, and all of these officers have kind of turned into specific projects, because I got to meet Geordie Beal in the flesh, his son. What could be more meaningful than learning the life story of this incredible infantry officer who I have a personal connection with the family now. So that's what drew me to it.
And then what happened to him after the war? So what's his story after the war?
Immediately after the war, he became, he stayed in the military and he worked with the cadet program. So he spent at least 3 years working full-time in rejuvenating the cadet program in the province of Ontario. After that, he didn't return to his old firm, even though they did retain his position for him for the duration of the war. That was pretty standard for most small, medium, large corporations in Canada at the time. And he became an insurance salesman afterwards. Oh.
Now, I know the answer may come from elsewhere in the room, but I'm wondering, is there any prospect of that treasure trove of 1,000 letters being published?
I'm working on it.
I have all 1,056 letters transcribed into the computer. I can now read his writing. It took me about 100 letters before that was possible. He writes even worse than I do. And he brought home about 4 months worth, 5 months worth of field message books, notebooks, and for a period of time between Cemetery Hill and Lamone, he actually taught for 3 months to the British Army about the lessons of Argonauts. So I have his notes from there as well. The answer is they are being gifted to the museum. Well, I haven't been persuaded yet that they should be published.
So if anyone wants to talk to Geordie tonight and tell him that would be a really great idea, then please feel free to do so.
I didn't know that. I should just tell you as a background. I didn't know much about his history because he died when I was 15. He had just turned 49. So I knew him as the guy who was teaching me to skate and the guy who took me down to Varsity Stadium so that I could have leftover uniform pieces from the Argonauts because he couldn't afford to buy me a football uniform. Didn't have any money at that time. So that's the kind of dad I knew. I knew sort of that he might have been in the military because he gave me a German helmet and a British helmet so that we and the other kids in the neighborhood could play army, whatever that meant. It wasn't until the regiment phoned me every 6 months from the day I started university until the day I told them after university, and I went down and said I was not interested in joining the regiment. Well, that was only 60 years ago, so there it is again. But the letters were fascinating, and learning from others is fascinating.
Any more questions? Speak now, forever hold your peace. No? Good. Tyler, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. We have
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.